Dragon Ball video games have been around almost as long as Dragon Ball itself. Goku made his first pixelated appearance mere months after the anime premiered in Japan, and since then there have been so many interactive electronic products featuring the iconic Saiyan, it's actually difficult to keep track of everything that counts as a Dragon Ball video game. Does that include mobile games, or LCD handhelds, or arcade cabinets, or FMV games played on forgotten consoles? What about crossover games that have guest-starred Dragon Ball characters, like Jump Force, but aren't technically Dragon Ball games? By our count, Dragon Ball Sparking Zero is something like the 160th interactive product featuring officially licensed Dragon Ball characters that involves pushing buttons and/or looking at a screen, so for lack of a better word, a video game. In the interest of your time and my own personal sanity, we're not even going to try to discuss every single one of those games, but instead, we're going to take a look at the evolution of Dragon Ball video games. Not to be confused with the video game of Dragon Ball Evolution, which we will touch on, and of course the many other different ways developers have tried to keep games about Goku hitting people interesting over the years. So without further ado, here are the best, worst, and weirdest Dragon Ball games ever made. Dragon Ball Dragon Daihikyo, or the Great Unexplored Dragon Region, was the first official video game based on Toriyama's hit manga-turned-anime. Released in the fall of 1986, this rudimentary shmup had Goku riding his flying Nimbus and whacking various creatures and bad guys with his power pole. He'd collect pieces of food and floating icons of his friends' heads, unlocking various bonuses and power-ups. You know, shmup stuff. The game itself isn't much to write home about, but what's notable about it is that it was one of just 30 games that was released for the ill-fated Super Cassette Vision. This would-be competitor to the Nintendo Famicom unfortunately very much wasn't one, causing its manufacturer Epic to dip out of the home console market entirely just a year later. Mind you, that's Epic with a CH, not the company that made Fortnite, which weirdly enough Goku is also in, along with everyone else. As evidenced by everything else I'm about to tell you in this video, there was clearly demand for Dragon Ball video games, but not even Goku could compete with the popularity of the Famicom, so hey, if you can't beat them, join them. Dragon Ball Shenron no Nazo is the first Dragon Ball game that most fans are aware of. Once again, Goku ran around whacking dudes with his power pole and collecting food, but in this case, there was a little more depth to it. Goku's appetite was gamified via a health bar that was constantly depleting unless he maintained a steady intake of calories. This has shown up in later Dragon Ball games and has also become a staple of the modern survival genre. Shenron no Nazo did a decent job adapting other parts of the subject matter as well, loosely retelling the first few episodes of the cartoon, with Goku squaring off against Oolong, Monster Carrot, and his future father-in-law, the Ox King. After defeating Emperor Pilaf, the Dragon Balls are used to summon Shenron, and the player can pick from one of 4 wishes. After making the first wish, there's a tournament, which is loosely in line with the anime, but after that, it gets a little bit weird. Goku goes to the moon where he fights Monster Carrot. Again, that's not the weird part. Goku does canonically send Monster Carrot to the moon, where he has to make candy for children for a year until he's atoned for his sins or whatever. What's weird is that in this game, one of his henchmen is a 4-armed alien version of Krillin named Krillian. Whose idea was that? Well, Akira Toriyama, whose concept art was actually included with the strategy guide. Something else that's interesting about Shenron no Nazo is that it was technically the first Dragon Ball anything released in the United States. It was rebranded Dragon Power, and a variety of changes were made, like turning all the flying panties into sandwiches and replacing Master Roshi with a generic wizard, who still inexplicably gets a nosebleed when he's surrounded by flying sandwiches. In addition to changing the name, the box art also replaced Toriyama's iconic hero with what appears to be a 40-year-old man twisting his ankle in Taekwondo class. Unsurprisingly, Dragon Ball's rising popularity led to more video games. Rather than stick to the action-adventure gameplay of the first Famicom game, the follow-up, Daimao Fukkatsu, shook things up by going the turn-based RPG route. But it also tried something extremely revolutionary. It was played using a virtual in-game deck of cards and had players navigating the overworld like a board game. In 2024, there are arguably too many deck builders and card battlers, but in 1988, they basically weren't a thing yet. Like, for context, this was half a decade before Magic the Gathering introduced the collectible card game, and it even predates Microsoft's Solitaire by 2 years. Up until that point, it's likely the most popular digital card games were video poker machines tucked away in casinos and dive bars, not official adaptations of after-school cartoons. Daimao Fukkatsu was a loose retelling of the Demon King Piccolo portion of Dragon Ball that didn't go too far off the beaten path narratively. Aside from a couple original characters, there was Lord Kanpei, a pink anthropomorphic elephant god who could transform into a giant hand, and Synthesizer, who played backup to Piccolo's other demon henchmen named after musical instruments. Daimao Fukkatsu's immediate follow-up, Dragon Ball 3 Gokuden,
Dragon Ball 3 Gokuden,
or Goku's story, came out in 1989 and applied the card-based RPG formula to adapt the entirety of Dragon Ball with an optional boss fight against Raditz at the very end as a treat. This game was released a few months after the Dragon Ball anime had concluded on television, only to re-emerge literally a week later as Dragon Ball Z. The heightened action and more serious tone of Z would make it a global hit and prove to be perfect fodder for video games, but as a result, classic Dragon Ball got backburnered a little bit, and games based on Goku's early adventures would be few and far between in the decades that followed, much to the dismay of me and 3 or 4 other people in the comments of this video. Gokuden was enough of a success that it became a sub-series all its own and spawned a few sequels, spin-offs, and remakes, most notably Dragon Ball Z Gaiden Saiyajin Zetsumetsu Keikaku, which I'm probably mispronouncing, so let's just call it the plan to eradicate the Saiyans. This was the first wholly original Dragon Ball story created for a video game. Shortly after the Famicom game's release, the story was adapted into a fully animated 2-part FMV game for Bandai's short-lived Playdia console, and then eventually just released on home video so people could watch the VHS tape the old-fashioned way. What's it about? Well, a disgruntled Tuffle named Dr. Lychee sends gas bombs to Earth that make our heroes lose the ability to use any energy attacks. So, using their fists and their wits, Goku and company battle never-before-seen all-new monsters named Arby, King Karn, Bon Karn, Gurei, Razak, Scud, Budo, Jiku, and Kawazu, and I swear I didn't make any of those up. Meanwhile, the late Frieza, his brother Cooler, Lord Slug, and Turles all come back as ghosts because reasons, and since Dr. Lychee is basically the Spirit Halloween version of Dr. Gero, it checks out that the big bad, his artificial creation Hachiyak, is basically we have perfect Cell at home, and Goku goes to space and kicks his ass. The end. As wackadoo as the plot of the Famicom RPG turned FMV game turned regular OVA was, it's not even the weirdest thing Toei Animation has created for an interactive piece of media. We've all played games on our mobile phones, but have you ever played a game with a landline phone plugged into your TV? Well, that's what Terebikko was. Another ill-fated piece of Bandai hardware, this one came and went a few years before the Playdia. Konnichiwa! And it also got an exclusive DBZ game, Atsumare Goku Warudo. Atsumare Goku Warudo! Or Gather Together, Goku's World. Clearly aimed at a younger audience, this was somewhere between Blue's Clues and those touchscreen trivia games you find in the back of some taxis and Ubers. In the game, Goku and other characters repeatedly call viewers on the phone to ask them multiple choice trivia questions, and players, namely children, push buttons on the Terebikko to answer. In addition to breaking the fourth wall repeatedly, it gets pretty silly. Goku travels back in time using Trunks' time machine, and despite Trunks' explicit warning to not interfere with the past, the first thing that Goku does is go pat his younger self on the head, which is probably pretty weird for a young kid when a dude who looks just like you shows up in a giant yellow rocket and starts touching you. Then in a final showdown with Cell, Goku punches him in the face so hard, Cell just says "F it" and goes home. Anyway, speaking of which, you'd think an anime about dudes punching, kicking, and throwing fireballs at each other would inspire more fighting games than card battlers and FMVs, and eventually it would. But before that could happen, the fighting game genre would need to be clearly established, and most people will agree that Street Fighter II was the game to do that when it landed in arcades in 1991. Prior to that, there were plenty of games that featured one-on-one battles viewed from the side, including several of the boss fights in that first Dragon Ball Famicom game, but it was Capcom's landmark brawler that would lay the groundwork for so many DBZ games to come. The first DBZ game that can be classified as a fighting game, rather than just a game that was about fighting, was Dragon Ball Z Gekito Tenkaichi Budokai, or a fierce battle at the #1 under heaven martial arts gathering. This was a pack-in for another oddball piece of Bandai hardware, the Datac Joint ROM System, an add-on for the Famicom that let players scan trading cards with barcodes on them to unlock characters and items in-game, with additional cards sold separately in booster packs. The actual gameplay was a rudimentary brawler, but that seemed like an afterthought to the gimmicky hardware. The DATAC joint ROM system was likely created in response to the success of the Barcode Battler, a handheld that functioned similarly and was developed by Epoch, that company that published that very first Dragon Ball game. In any case, Bandai's version wasn't a huge hit, but it was clearly onto something. Other games would utilize similar technology, and the Toys to Life craze would capitalize on the same core principles decades later. On a more cynical note, selling physical booster packs to unlock stuff in a video game is pretty much an analog version of modern in-game microtransactions. So, thanks Bandai, I guess. With the popularity of Street Fighter II, it was only a matter of time before DBZ got a proper arcade cabinet of its own, and while the game might not have been much to write home about, the cabinet itself was awesome. Personally designed by Toriyama, the first DBZ arcade game was played on the belly of a large robot dressed like Goku. Toriyama has drawn plenty of robots over the years, and this arcade cabinet is clearly a distant relative of Robo from Chrono Trigger, as well as Vegeta, who would show up in Dragon Ball Super decades later. However, unlike the impossible-to-budge Vegeta, this arcade robot had the exact opposite problem. Its feet needed to be reinforced to keep it from toppling over and crushing players. The arcade game itself featured some very large sprites, which were a step up from what home consoles were capable of displaying at the time, though this new challenger might have posed more of a threat to Street Fighter II if its combat hadn't been quite so sluggish. Obviously, Bandai wasn't forgetting the home console market though, and DBZ's first notable fighting game hit Super Famicom the same year as the robot Goku lumbered into arcades. Dragon Ball Z Super Butoden was the first proper 2D fighter, and it was a hit, spawning 2 whole sequels in just a year and a half after it launched, as well as a Mega Drive port. The Butoden games might feel a little clunky compared to modern fighters these days, but they were pretty ambitious for their time. A shameless Street Fighter II clone might have seemed like a safe bet, but Capcom was also refining their secret sauce with new turbo, hyper-fighting champion iterations every 20 minutes, and it's harder to copy somebody's homework when they keep changing their own answers. Instead, Tosei, the developer of Butoden, as well as half the other Dragon Ball games I've mentioned so far, took it a step further and infused their 2D fighter with a few mechanics that made it more authentic to the anime. While most fighting games required a button combo to execute any kind of ranged attack, basically all of Butoden's roster could launch ki blasts with the press of a button, with more complex combos unleashing epic meteor attacks. Street Fighter was all about fighting in the street, but the sky was the limit in Butoden. Players would fight underwater, in midair, and everywhere in between. To account for the larger scale bouts, if combatants got far enough apart, the screen would dynamically split in half, which was a pretty novel solution that hadn't really been seen much at the time. Plenty has been said about the timelessness of sprite work in the 16-bit era, and the Butoden series is a phenomenal example of it. In fact, if you're a Dragon Ball fan old enough that your hair is starting to turn a little bit Ultra Instinct Silver around the edges, you probably have fond memories of Butoden sprites, whether or not you realize it. At this point, animated GIFs are basically just lower-res video clips, but back in the days of dial-up, limited image compression, and even more limited bandwidth resulted in these sprites getting repurposed to create some of the coolest online computer animation this side of Newgrounds. Odds are, if you missed Toonami because you had soccer practice or detention or group therapy and went online looking for an episode summary to see what you'd missed, you'd sooner or later wind up on a GeoCities or Angel Fire page plastered with little pixelated DBZ characters doing special moves on repeat, and you have Butoden to thank for that. Kame, Hame, hey, please sign my guest book. Probably the best DBZ game of the 16-bit era was Hyperdimension, which arrived for the Super Famicom when its successors had already made their presence known. It released just a few months before the Nintendo 64's launch in Japan, and well over a year after the PS1 and Saturn had already taken off. Hyperdimension had a much smaller roster than the Butoden games, but one look at its gorgeous sprite work excused that, and its gameplay offered a tighter, leaner experience built on the fundamentals of its predecessors while adding its own flair, like desperation attacks. These incredibly powerful special moves could only be executed when a player's life bar was in the red with 80 HP or less, and in addition to dealing major damage, they also channeled some of DBZ's more epic moments. Sadly, Hyperdimension could be seen as something of a last-ditch desperation attack of the 16-bit era against the 3D graphics the new consoles were capable of. In 1995, the first DBZ game for the original PlayStation was released, titled Ultimate Battle 22. Though it was originally planned as part of the Butoden series, it was renamed to reflect what was at the time a massive roster of playable characters. Quantity doesn't necessarily come at the expense of quality, as demonstrated by Sparking Zero's massive lineup, but in the case of Ultimate Battle, it very much did. Clunky combat and limited game modes made the game a chore to play, but it was somehow even worse to look at. While the characters remained sprites, the environments were now rendered in 3D. In lieu of the novel dynamic split screen that Butoden had used to give players more room to play, UB22 made the bizarre choice to just scale them down instead. As a result, aside from the slick opening cinematic, the game looked less like the stylish anime that we knew and loved from Toonami, and more like a hilariously low-budget Adult Swim show. You can't tell me that Ultimate Battle 22 doesn't make DBZ look a little bit like Aqua Teen Hunger Force.
You and your third dimension.
What about it?
Oh, nothing. It's cute.
A fully 3D Dragon Ball game was a matter of when, not if, and that when was 1997 with the release of Dragon Ball Final Bout. Visually, it's more consistent than Ultimate Battle 22 for committing to 3D graphics, but it's still not exactly cutting edge, and it really wasn't when it came out either. Anybody wanting a fighting game with 3D recreations of Toriyama characters already got a better looking version of that a year prior with Tobal No. 1.
Tobal No. 1. Characters designed by Akira Toriyama.
Wanting basically nothing to do with Dragon Ball at that point, Toriyama had lent his considerable talents to conceptualizing the roster of a completely original fighting game.
Full 360-degree free movement battles.
As for Final Bout, what it lacked in the graphics department, it unfortunately didn't really make up for anywhere else. Oddly enough, this would be the first Dragon Ball game officially published in North America that was actually called Dragon Ball and actually featured Goku on the cover instead of 70s van airbrush art. In a completely baffling marketing move, despite being called Dragon Ball Final Bout in Japan, Bandai decided to slap GT on the American release. Dragon Ball GT was airing in Japan at the time, so it would have made sense to do it over there, but stateside, DBZ was still in the Frieza saga during its original network TV run. It wouldn't come to Toonami for another year, and Dragon Ball GT, the anime, wouldn't be localized for 6 years at that point. Think about it. American viewers had just been introduced to Goku and his kid, Gohan, and here was a video game where Gohan was a full-grown adult and Goku was inexplicably a kid again. Who signed off on that? I actually made a whole other video about how miraculous it is that DBZ was a hit in the United States because of bizarre decisions like this one, but thankfully it was because its sudden newfound popularity in the States would lead to some of the best games ever. By the late 90s and early aughts, Dragon Ball's popularity had waned in Japan. After the Dragon Ball Z anime concluded, Dragon Ball GT attempted to continue the story without Toriyama's direct involvement, but was missing that secret ingredient. And even if the creator had been directly involved, it's possible that audiences would have been burnt out anyway. 11.5 years after the Dragon Ball anime premiered, GT concluded, and the steady stream of merchandise that had been going on that whole time, including video games, slowed to a trickle. However, over in the United States, DBZ was just catching on. By 2002, its popularity had reached a fever pitch. Its Nielsen ratings were topping the charts among multiple key demographics. It was the #1 show on cable for tweens aged 9 to 14, boys aged 9 to 14, and men aged 12 to 24, and it was the #1 show period across network and cable TV for boys aged 9 to 14. So suck it, Survivor Thailand.
What else can we say? Dragon Ball Z, weeknights at 6.
2002 was also the year we got the first Dragon Ball video game developed outside of Japan, Dragon Ball Z: The Legacy of Goku. This Game Boy Advance exclusive was developed by Illinois-based Webfoot Technologies, whose earlier work had mostly consisted of CD-ROM multi-packs of arcade game clones like Bluppo and 3D Maze Man Amazing Adventures. On paper, Legacy of Goku had all the markings of the kind of unplayable licensed shovelware that would soon infest the GBA's library, and you know, it wasn't that great, but it was way better than it had any right to be, okay? A top-down action RPG that adapted DBZ up through Goku's showdown with Frieza on Namek, it made an admirable attempt to jam the laundry list of shit that made the show so cool into a cartridge the size of a ketchup packet. This is a show primarily focused on drawn-out one-on-one battles between characters who can fly and shoot energy blasts powerful enough to literally level the playing field, so why would you expect an evenly paced, grounded video game with a figuratively level playing field? This is a problem DBZ games had always struggled with and continue to struggle with to this day. Legacy of Goku is not the best DBZ game, but come on, it is far from the worst. I will always jump to its defense because I love that little game. Anyway, a year later, Webfoot returned with a sequel that more than made up for the first installment's shortcomings, not only improving on the moment-to-moment gameplay in every area, but also quintupling the length of the campaign. It adapted the series all the way from the appearance of Trunks through the end of the Cell games, including a post-credit sequence that unlocked Mr. Satan, aka Hercule, as a playable character and had him going on a talk show to boast about how he kicked Cell's ass, which is pretty funny. In 2004, Webfoot returned again with a third legacy of Goku, subtitled Boo's Fury. It wrapped up the rest of DBZ's story, and though it wasn't received quite as well as the second game, it's still among the better Dragon Ball games, especially in the handheld department. The fact that a studio with no apparent experience making action RPGs managed to adapt the entirety of Dragon Ball Z into a very playable trilogy of games in just a few years is pretty impressive. But backtracking to 2002, Legacy of Goku was by no means the only game in the cards for DBZ fans, and they were dealt two other handheld offerings. Dragon Ball Z, the collectible card game, also hit GBA, which digitized the popular analog TCG, though it really didn't go out of its way to do too much else. Anyone who didn't care for card games to begin with probably wasn't blown away by its clerical, menu-heavy presentation of this action-packed anime, and anyone seriously invested in the real-life game was probably more inclined to spend their money on new booster packs than a video game that was incapable of getting any future expansions. Meanwhile, Legendary Super Warriors arrived on Game Boy Color. Between its diminutive top-down overworld that funneled into one-on-one turn-based battles featuring slightly more detailed but still adorably minimalistic sprites, it's easy to draw comparisons to the early Pokemon games at a glance. On closer inspection, Legendary Super Warriors was wholly its own thing, incorporating a novel card-based combat system which also hinged on time button combos to execute moves and the added strategic element of positioning on its grid-based battlefield. So basically a turn-based fighting game. Despite being one of the best DBZ games to come out that year, possibly ever, it was also one of the very last Game Boy Color games released, and its rudimentary visuals paled in comparison to what else was coming out at the time, especially when compared to what was happening over on consoles. Enter Dragon Ball Z Budokai. Just Budokai, hold the Tenkaichi, which would go down in history as the first 3D DBZ game that didn't totally suck ass. Unlike Final Bout's low-poly balloon animal interpretations of Toriyama's beloved designs, Budokai's visuals were gorgeously faithful, and even better, it wasn't anywhere near as miserable to play as the much-maligned PS1 brawler. Despite having 3D models in a 3D space, Budokai's combat stayed fairly 2D, though its dynamic camera bobbed and weaved along with the action enough to keep things interesting. Budokai is by no means the best Dragon Ball Z fighting game of the PS2 era. It's not even the best one with Budokai in the title. What it was a competent and polished enough video game based on a massively popular franchise that it was in the right place at the right time to amass a lot of passionate admirers. Thankfully, Budokai 2 more than made up for it, expanding and improving in all the ways one might expect, as well as a few that nobody really saw coming. There were some hilarious what-if mashup characters like the Tien and Yamcha fusion Tiensha, and the even less probable Gokule that showed what would happen if Goku and Hercule both put on Potara earrings. Best of all, though, was Cellin, which imagined a version of Cell that absorbed Krillin instead of Android 18.
I'm not gonna let some punk like you walk all over me!
2003 was a busy year for Dragon Ball games, and while the Budokai and Legacy of Goku sequels were high points, Webfoot Technologies dropped Taiketsu that year, which was lambasted as one of the worst games in franchise history at the time of its release, and it definitely hasn't gotten any better with age. While the faults of many subpar fighting games become apparent after putting them through their paces, Taiketsu was recognizable as dog shit from Orbit. If Ultimate Battle 22 looked more like Aqua Teen Hunger Force than DBZ, this looked like Robot Chicken streaming on Real Player over a 28K modem. Supposedly, the sprites were made using leftover character models for a scrapped PS2 game, but development was so rushed that there was no time for the necessary touch-up. Making a decent DBZ fighting game for the GBA isn't impossible though, as Arc System Works would demonstrate less than a year later with DBZ Supersonic Warriors. The studio had a bit more experience making fighters and had several iterations of Guilty Gear under its belt at that point, so that probably helped. As I mentioned earlier, one of the challenges with developing Dragon Ball Z games that are faithful to the source material is that the source material is, technically speaking, completely fucking batshit bananas bonkers. On the other hand, classic original flavor Dragon Ball doesn't really deal with any of that stuff, and Dragon Ball Advanced Adventure managed to faithfully adapt Goku's early life into a good old-fashioned beat-em-up that kept it nice and simple. Despite the title, Advanced Adventure was refreshingly rudimentary in terms of gameplay, but, like Goku, it might have seemed small and simple, but it packed one hell of a punch. Completing the main campaign would unlock a roster of 30 playable characters for boss rush and time attack modes, who could then be pitted against each other in one-on-one matches, against AI, or another player with a copy of the game and a link cable. Of course, over on consoles, advances were being made to properly gamify that totally fucking bonkers appeal of DBZ. The Budokai series had paved the way for Budokai Tenkaichi, which may have seemed like a direct continuation stateside, but was effectively a whole new series. In Japan, Budokai was simply titled Dragon Ball Z, while Budokai Tenkaichi was Dragon Ball Z Sparking, taking its name from one of the few English words sporadically scattered through the Japanese opening theme. It seems like the logic was for Budokai Tenkaichi to capitalize on the Western success of Budokai, which was kind of a bizarre marketing choice to begin with, since its namesake, the recurring Tenkaichi Budokai event that Goku competes in several times throughout the story, was localized as the World Martial Arts Tournament for the English dub, so American casual fans didn't really know what a Budokai or a Tenkaichi Budokai was. Budokai Tenkaichi expanded on Budokai both spatially, going from 2.5D combat into fully 3D stages with destructible environments and a roster so stacked it was probably a fire code violation. The first game had 58 playable characters, or 90 if you're carrying all the various transformations, fusions, and not quite final forms, and by Tenkaichi 3 a few years later, that roster had nearly doubled. Unfortunately, the roster of people who were actively invested in Dragon Ball was shrinking. By the time of Budokai Tenkaichi 3's release, the entirety of Dragon Ball, Dragon Ball Z, and Dragon Ball GT had aired in the United States, and all 17 animated movies had since been localized. It had been well over a decade since Akira Toriyama had any major involvement with the series. He'd helped lay the groundwork for GT, but then he'd pieced out for a much-needed break from drawing Goku. So, somebody else stepped in to take fans on a whole new adventure set in that beloved universe. Unfortunately, that someone was 20th Century Fox, and that whole new adventure was the live-action feature film Dragon Ball Evolution, which is not a good movie.
You're special, Goku.
No, I'm different.
It says a lot about a movie when the PSP game based on it gets more praise, but that's exactly what happened with Evolution. As much as everyone hates that movie, the game is way better than it has any right to be, largely because it's essentially a reskin of the two earlier Dragon Ball Shin Budokai PSP games. The most bizarre thing about it, though, is the voice cast. Rather than pull from the recognizable Funimation stable or shell out for talent from the movie, the Dragon Ball Evolution devs hired other voice actors, including Yuri Lowenthal and Cam Clark. So if you've ever wanted to hear Sasuke from Naruto shouting Kamehameha, there you go. That's what that is. As for Evolutions, by the 20-teens, DBZ games had undergone a lot of transformations, and they continued to mutate. They'd gone from turn-based RPGs played with virtual cards to real-time arcade fighters played by mashing buttons, and everything in between.
Dragon Ball Heroes!
In 2010, Dragon Ball Heroes debuted in Japanese arcades, which went full circle by returning to the card-based combat of the earliest Famicom games but incorporated physical cards. Bandai finally capitalized on the business model Gekido Tenkaichi Budokai had attempted way back on the Datac joint ROM system decades earlier, and it went on to be quite a hit, spawning handheld versions, not to mention an original manga and web series. Best of all, it brought back Hachiyak. Remember Hachiyak? He's back, in webtoon form. A steady trickle of video games was all very well and good, but around this time, Dragon Ball fans had something to really get excited about. 2013, Akira Toriyama came out of quasi-retirement, and so did his beloved cast of characters when Dragon Ball Z Battle of Gods hit theaters. It was followed by Resurrection F, which in turn kicked off the Dragon Ball Super anime series, which I guess you could say super effing resurrected the franchise faster than a senzu bean.
Senzu beans.
Free-to-play Dragon Ball mobile game featuring collectible characters unlocked via gacha loot boxes would have probably been lucrative no matter what, but the fact that brand new characters were being introduced every week on Super might have had something to do with how quickly Dragon Ball Z Dokkan Battle raked in well over $3 billion globally, and I'd be willing to bet a rare drop Kefla card is probably the most money a large group of people has ever spent for a mixture of kale and cauliflower. At this point, there had been single-player, multiplayer, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, and even hyper-dimensional Dragon Ball games, so what next? Well, how about a massively multiplayer, four-dimensional game? Okay, so time travel wasn't new to DBZ, and Dragon Ball Heroes and the short-lived MMO Dragon Ball Online had dabbled in exploring alternate realities, but it was Dragon Ball Xenoverse that dove in headfirst and made a splash. DBZ has some amazing fights, but you can only relive them so many times before they start to get a little bit old. So, rather than stay faithful to the source material, Xenoverse deliberately fucked it up beyond all possible recognition, and Trunks enlisted players to help sort it out using their original characters who were members of the Time Patrol. Dragon Ball Xenoverse melded action RPG progression with the systems from earlier 3D fighters, and it worked. Xenoverse spawned a sequel, which has amassed 17 DLC packs to date, and there's no end in sight as of making this video, so I think people like it. Fortunately, anyone who felt like Xenoverse had lost the plot has been given plenty of other options for more conventional approaches to Dragon Ball games. In 2018, Arc System Works, the studio who'd knocked out a handful of solid DBZ fighting games on handheld, stepped into the ring on consoles with Fighterz, which would go on to become the world heavyweight champ of 2D Dragon Brawlers. The studio had been shamelessly grinding away at Guilty Gear and leaving a trail of BlazBlues in their wake, so channeling that knowledge into a fast-paced, flashy 2D fighter packed with Saiyans, androids, Majins, and everything in between proved to be a hit with casual Goku enjoyers and hardcore fighting game enthusiasts alike. Fighterz was technically sound and balanced enough that it made its way into the fighting game esports circuit, making it the first Dragon Ball game to be featured prominently at EVO. However, its acceptance by the serious competitive crowd may have worked against it a little bit, creating a barrier to entry for more casual players by making online multiplayer less of a challenge for newcomers and more of an unforgiving vortex of immediate ass-kicking. This, plus minor tweaks and the addition of 20 DLC characters, may have knocked Fighterz off balance a little bit. Android 21, the original Toriyama-designed character created for the game, got an alternate DLC version with a lab coat that was ridiculously overpowered compared to her non-lab coat version. Even by Dragon Ball standards, where characters regularly become more powerful by taking off weighted clothes, changing their hair color, or putting on earrings, this lab coat was absurd. But hey, a STEM career can put some extra zeros on your net worth, so who's to say it can't do the same for your power level? Stay in school, kids. After Fighterz found such success with a modern spin on a 2D Dragon Ball fighting game, it was only fitting that a studio take another crack at a good old-fashioned DBZ RPG. CyberConnect 2 was that studio, and the team knew a thing or two about gamifying long-running martial arts anime series starring spiky yellow-haired guys in orange and blue outfits, as they had shipped 17 Naruto titles before their first Dragon Ball game. That game was Dragon Ball Z Kakarot, which was nothing if not ambitious. An action RPG retelling of the entirety of Dragon Ball Z, including plenty of filler episodes in the form of side quests scattered throughout several massive, not quite open worlds. Speaking of which, this game has an amazing selection of Toriyama's wonderful vehicles, but they're mostly pointless. There's a reason that Goku never got his driver's license. He can fucking fly and teleport. DBZ Kakarot is so close to being my perfect DBZ game. It's like Legacy of Goku crossed with the Yakuza series. Still, it sold well, and it faithfully recreated so many elements of Toriyama's universe, so there's plenty of good things to say about it. And hey, the original Dragon Ball just turned 40, and Black Myth Wukong, a Journey to the West inspired ARPG about a monkey guy with a stick, just did bananas numbers, so maybe a smaller, slower paced, more literally grounded Kakarot prequel about Goku's childhood adventures could happen? Please? Bandai? Shenron? Anybody?
As you wish. Farewell.
Anyway, in terms of dream Dragon Ball games, I'm definitely in the minority there. The game that most fans have been demanding for close to 2 decades was a proper full-scale follow-up to Budokai Tenkaichi 3, and Tenkaichi Tag Team didn't count.
Break through the limit!
This year, they finally got it in the form of Dragon Ball Sparking Zero. It didn't reinvent the 3D arena combat or over-the-top special attacks of the earlier games, but it updated the visuals, incorporated online features, and best of all, shipped with a flabbergasting roster of 182 playable characters, which is only going to get bigger with DLC. Waiting 17 years for a new installment of a game series sucks, but it clearly built anticipation. Sparking Zero is to date the fastest selling Dragon Ball game in franchise history, crossing the 3 million mark in just 24 hours post-launch, and amazingly, it was breaking records before it was officially out. During its early access period, the concurrent player count on Steam alone was over 90,000.
9,000? There's no way that could be right!
No, 90,000. Sparking Zero is sparking a lot of zeros. And that means we're definitely going to see more Dragon Ball games in years to come, and really, that's fine with me. Akira Toriyama may be primarily celebrated for his influence in the manga and anime space, but he also had one foot in video games pretty much from day one. In addition to the immensely popular Dragon Quest series, he'd also provide original character designs for Chrono Trigger, Blue Dragon, Tobal Numbers 1 and 2, and the lesser-known Go-Go Ackman. In this day and age, video games are a massively popular, lucrative, and legitimate entertainment medium. 1986 was the year Dragon Ball leapt from the page to the screen in both cartoon and cartridge form, and it also saw the debut of the Dragon Quest series. Back then, video games had more in common with children's toys and slot machines. In the mid-1980s, as a manga artist, Akira Toriyama's livelihood was primarily riding on Japanese schoolchildren spending their pocket money on the latest issue of Shonen Jump, not pumping it into arcade cabinets or saving up for the latest Famicom game. Toriyama's decision to get involved with this upstart medium may have shown a keen business acumen, an open mind toward new ideas, an innate sense of what kids are interested in, some combination thereof, or maybe he just thought video games were cool. And he was right, and we're better off because of it. Between the Dragon Ball manga and Dragon Quest, in 1986 Toriyama had more than enough on his plate, so you wouldn't blame him for letting the developers of that very first Dragon Ball Famicom game borrow designs from his existing artwork and just work with that. But instead, he redesigned one of his most popular characters as a weird nunchuck-wielding alien and created a bunch of other new bad guys for Goku to fight in this new video game, which is a level of involvement and collaboration you rarely see from creators when it comes to video game tie-ins, even now. Akira Toriyama may not be with us, but his legacy lives on across multiple mediums, and it's especially prevalent in games, whether it's in the form of Mario's Tanuki Suit Waddle following in the footsteps of Dr. Slump's robot heroine Arale, or Japan's ongoing infestation by its most invasive species, those adorable slimes from Dragon Quest, or Ken, Ryu, and company borrowing a little bit of Goku's ki every time they unleash a Hadouken. 40 years after he was created, players are going cuckoo for Goku more than ever, so it's safe to say that Dragon Ball video games still haven't achieved their final form, and they probably never will. Anyway, in case I didn't make it abundantly clear, there are a lot of Dragon Ball games, but there were also a bunch that I didn't touch on in this video, like Dragon Ball Z for Kinect, which is played without any actual physical touch, or the Raging Blast games, which some of you in the comments are probably raging about and putting me on blast for leaving out. So let me know, what's your favorite Dragon Ball game, and what's the worst game that you love dearly in spite of all of its flaws, and what's the widely praised fan favorite you could never get into, and what's your absolute pie-in-the-sky dream game that Bandai would never make in a million years? Is it an asymmetrical survival horror game where Yajirobe and Oolong the sex pest pig and that farmer that Raditz murdered have to survive against villains who can literally destroy planets? Oh wait, they actually made that game. Anyway, whatever it is, let me know in the comments below. And hey, if you're not sick of hearing me talk about Dragon Ball, check out my breakdown of DBZ's awkward journey to take off in the United States. And for everything Dragon Ball, keep it right here on IGN. I swear, I know we gave Sparking Zero a 7, but a bunch of us really love Goku.